a Sami tracker who came along to handle the snowmobile and the dogs, and to know where the slope of the land would betray you in a whiteout. The cabin was 60 kilometers from the nearest road, 60 kilometers in a Norwegian winter through old-growth pine, with snow that came up past your hip in places. You did not walk out of there. The supply runs came every 9 days. If you were hurt, you waited. The foreman's name was Henrik Solberg. He was 58 years old that winter. He had been logging the inland forests of Trøndelag since he was 16. His face was a map of weather. His hands were the kind of hands that have held an axe for so many decades that they no longer fully open when relaxed. He had buried 2 wives and 1 son. He drank black coffee from morning until the moment he closed his eyes, and he never spoke unless he had something to say. The Sami tracker was a man named Aslak Sara. He was 41. He was from a reindeer herding family in Finnmark, far up in the Arctic, and he had come south for the wages. He spoke Norwegian softly, with the long vowels of the north, and he spoke North Sami to the dogs, and he never once entered the forest without first taking a small bone, which he kept on a leather thong around his neck.